August 1943, the air at 30,000 feet is thin, bitter, and deceptively still. It is late 1943, and the sky over the Mediterranean is a vast, unforgiving canvas of cerulean. Inside the cockpit of a Luftwaffe Messerschmitt Bf 109, the pilot's breath fogs against his oxygen mask in rhythmic, jagged bursts. He is scanning the horizon for the familiar silhouettes of Spitfires or the lumbering frames of B-17s. Instead, he sees a flash of polished aluminum reflecting the harsh sunlight, a shape that defies the traditional geometry of aerial combat. Two twin-boom shadows materialize from the glare, diving with a terrifying lack of engine roar. These are Lockheed P-38 Lightnings. Before the German can bank into a defensive spiral, the lead Lightning unleashes a concentrated stream of fire from its nose, not from the wings, but from a centralized point of lethality. As he hauls back on the stick to escape the vertical dive, he realizes the trap has already been set. Another pair of Lightnings is screaming in from his 6 o'clock, converging from the opposite vector. To the German pilots, these are no longer mere aircraft. They are der Gabelschwanzteufel, the fork-tailed devils, and they have just turned the sky into a kill zone. The genesis of the P-38 Lightning was not born from a desire for a versatile fighter, but from a desperate, calculated need for raw performance. In February 1937, the United States Army Air Corps issued Circular Proposal X-608, a document that would change the trajectory of aeronautical engineering. The military was looking for a high-altitude interceptor capable of reaching speeds of 360 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, a staggering requirement at a time when most frontline biplanes were still struggling to break the 250-mile-per-hour barrier. The Army wanted a machine that could climb rapidly and hit hard, a sentinel to guard the American coasts against an emerging generation of fast, long-range bombers. At Lockheed, a young and ambitious engineer named Clarence Kelly, Johnson looked at the requirements and realized that a conventional single-engine design would never suffice. The drag created by a massive engine and the weight of the necessary fuel would negate the performance gains. Johnson's solution was radical. He would use two engines. But rather than mounting them on a traditional fuselage, he designed a revolutionary twin-boom airframe. This layout allowed the heavy Allison V1710 engines and their turbo superchargers to be housed in separate nacelles, while the pilot sat in a central pod flanked by the very power plants that propelled him. This design was more than just an aesthetic choice. It was a solution to the physics of flight that had plagued previous twin-engine attempts. By using counter-rotating propellers, where the left engine rotated clockwise and the right rotated counterclockwise, Johnson eliminated the critical engine problem. Most twin-engine planes suffered from a violent torque pull if one engine failed, often flipping the aircraft into a fatal spin. The P-38, however, was balanced. It was stable, it was fast, and it possessed a range that was, at the time, unheard of for a fighter. When the prototype, the XP-38, took to the skies in January 1939, it shattered expectations. During a high-profile cross-country dash from California to New York in February of that year, the aircraft crossed the continent in just 7 hours and 2 minutes. Although the prototype crashed during landing due to carburetor icing and short-field complications, the potential was undeniable. The United States finally had a fighter that could fly higher and faster than anything in the world. However, as the shadows of war lengthened over Europe and the Pacific, the Lightning would have to evolve from a sophisticated speed racer into a rugged instrument of war. The transition would be anything but smooth, as the aircraft prepared to face the battle-hardened veterans of the Luftwaffe in a theater of operations that would test every bolt and rivet of Kelly Johnson's masterpiece. As the United States was thrust into the global conflict following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the P-38 Lightning was rushed from the drawing boards of Burbank to the frost-bitten airfields of the United Kingdom and the sun-scorched strips of North Africa. By late 1942, the 8th Air Force in England was struggling. Their early daylight bombing raids against German industrial hubs were proving disastrous. The B-17 flying fortresses were being torn apart by Luftwaffe interceptors once they moved beyond the limited range of Spitfires and P-47 Thunderbolts. The bomber crews were calling for an escort that could stay with them all the way to the target and back. The P-38 was the only fighter in the American arsenal with the internal fuel capacity to even attempt the mission. However, the arrival of the Lightning in the European Theater of Operations, ETO, was met with a harsh reality. The P-38 had been designed in the temperate climate of California, and its complex systems were ill-prepared for the brutal, high-altitude cold of Northern Europe. Pilots found themselves in unheated cockpits at 30,000 feet, where temperatures dropped to 60 degrees below zero. Frostbite became as much of a threat as enemy fire. The intercoolers, designed to keep the engines from overheating, worked too well in the frigid air, causing the Allison engines to run too cold, leading to lead fouling of spark plugs and catastrophic engine failures mid-flight. Furthermore, the Luftwaffe pilots were not the inexperienced novices the Americans had hoped for. Men like Adolf Galland and his Abbeville boys were flying the latest Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109GS. They quickly learned that while the P-38 was faster in a straight line, its large surface area and the physics of its twin booms made it slower to roll than their nimble, single-engine fighters. The German tactic was simple: dive on the Lightnings from above, exploit their compressibility issues in high-speed dives, and force them into a turning dogfight where the heavier American plane would lose energy. Despite these teething problems, the P-38 began to find its stride in the Mediterranean Theater, MTO. In the wider, more open expanses of the desert and the sea, the Lightning's range became its greatest asset. It could strike at Axis shipping lanes and transport aircraft far beyond the reach of any other Allied fighter. It was here, during the Tunisian campaign and the invasion of Sicily, that the P-38 earned its fearsome reputation. The Americans began to refine their tactics, moving away from individual dogfights and toward coordinated squadron maneuvers. They realized that when P-38s worked in pairs or elements, they could overwhelm the Luftwaffe. By the time the summer of 1943 arrived, the German High Command began receiving reports of a new and terrifying phenomenon. American fighters that didn't just attack in waves, but synchronized their strikes from multiple vectors simultaneously, leaving the defenders with no room to maneuver. The P-38 Lightning was not just an evolutionary step in aviation. It was a radical departure from every established norm of the 1940s. To understand why German pilots felt a unique sense of dread when facing this aircraft, one must look at the technological angle. Unlike the Spitfire or the Messerschmitt, which housed their machine guns and cannons in the wings, the P-38 featured a concentrated powerhouse in the nose. 4.50 caliber machine guns and one 20mm Hispano cannon were packed into the central nacelle. In a standard fighter, pilots had to worry about convergence, the specific distance where wing-mounted fire met at a single point. If the enemy was too close or too far, the bullets would straddle the target. But for a P-38 pilot, the fire was a straight, unrelenting saw of lead and high-explosive shells. This meant a Lightning could hit accurately at ranges of up to 1,000 yards, tearing through German engines before the Luftwaffe pilots even reached their own effective firing distance. This technological superiority fed directly into the tactical angle. American commanders realized that the P-38's greatest strength was its ability to control the energy of a fight. They pioneered the dive and zoom, or boom and zoom methodology. Rather than entering a low-speed turning duel, where the nimble Bf-109 held the advantage, the P-38s used their massive twin-engine power to strike from a height advantage. They would dive, unleash a devastating burst from their concentrated nose guns, and then use their superior climb rate to skyrocket back to safety before the Germans could react. Perhaps most terrifying for the Luftwaffe was the pincer maneuver. Because the P-38 carried so much internal fuel, squadrons could split up and still have the endurance to find each other again. One flight would draw the German interceptors' attention, while a second flight, often miles away, would swing around in a wide arc. By the time the German pilots committed to an attack, they would find themselves caught in a lethal geometric trap, with P-38s closing in from 2 or 3 directions at once. The sky was no longer a series of individual duels. It had become a coordinated, multi-directional net of fire. From a German perspective, the P-38 was a psychological nightmare. In the Luftwaffe, aircraft were generally categorized by their silhouettes. A single engine meant a fighter, and 2 engines usually meant a vulnerable bomber or a heavy, sluggish Zerstorer like the Bf-110. When the P-38 first appeared, German pilots expected an easy kill. They were shocked to find a twin-engine machine that could outclimb them and hold its own in a high-speed dive. The sheer strangeness of the twin-boom design earned it the nickname Der Gabelschwanzteufel, the fork-tailed devil. German intelligence reports from 1943 began to note a drop in morale among transport pilots flying over the Mediterranean. They knew that if a P-38 spotted them, their slow-moving junkers stood no chance against an aircraft that could strike from a distance and disappear before the escorts could even turn. Then there was the pilot's angle, which revealed the physical and mental toll of operating such a complex machine. While the P-38 was a powerhouse, it was also a demanding master. The cockpit was notoriously cramped and, in a European theater, dangerously cold. Pilots often flew for 6 to 8 hours at a time, their hands numbed by the freezing air, while simultaneously managing the complex controls of 2 independent engines. They had to balance throttles, mixtures, and prop pitches perfectly. An error in management could lead to an engine stall at the worst possible moment. Yet there was a profound sense of lightning pride. Those who mastered the P-38 felt they were flying the most sophisticated weapon in the sky. They weren't just pilots. They were systems managers of a twin-engine beast that required finesse to prevent it from tearing itself apart in a high-speed compressibility tuck. Finally, we must consider the moral and strategic angle. For the Allied High Command, the P-38 represented the first true, long-range reach of American air power. It changed the morality of the air war by providing protection to the bomber crews who had previously felt like tethered goats. Strategically, the P-38's presence meant that no part of Festung Europa or the Japanese-held Pacific was safe. The P-38 was the chosen instrument for missions that required surgical precision and extreme endurance, missions that were often high-risk and high-reward. This strategic flexibility made the Lightning the ultimate tool for a war of attrition, slowly bleeding the axis of its best pilots and most vital resources through relentless, multi-directional pressure. The true test of the P-38's multi-directional lethality arrived in the spring of 1943 during the final, desperate days of the Axis presence in North Africa. This period, known as the Palm Sunday Massacre, serves as the definitive demonstration of the pincer tactics that terrified the Luftwaffe. On April 18, 1943, Allied intelligence intercepted reports of a massive German aerial convoy attempting to ferry fuel and reinforcements from Sicily to Tunisia. The Luftwaffe, desperate to keep their ground forces supplied, gathered over 100 aircraft, 65 junkers, 52 transports, protected by a dense screen of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Macchi C.202s. They believed that by flying low over the water, they could evade detection. They were wrong. High above, at 18,000 feet, the 57th and 79th Fighter Groups, equipped with P-38 Lightnings, were waiting. The Americans didn't just dive in a single, disorganized mass. They executed a textbook high-low pincer. While one squadron of Lightnings dropped their external fuel tanks and screamed down from the sun to engage the German fighter screen, a second squadron, led by the P-38s of the 14th Fighter Group, stayed wide and low, skimming the waves to cut off the transport's retreat back towards Sicily. The German pilots found themselves in a geometric nightmare. As they banked to engage the P-38s diving from above, they were suddenly raked by fire from the P-38s coming off the deck. The concentrated nose fire of the Lightnings was devastating. Because the guns were fixed in the center, the American pilots could snip the wings off the lumbering Ju-52s from nearly half a mile away. In the span of just 10 minutes, the sky was filled with parachutes and burning wreckage. The Luftwaffe pilots reported a sense of total encirclement. No matter which way they turned, a fork-tailed devil was already there, anticipating their maneuver. By the end of the engagement, over 24 German transports and nearly a dozen fighters were destroyed, while the P-38s suffered minimal losses. It was a slaughter that shattered the Luftwaffe's confidence in their ability to protect their Mediterranean lifelines. While the slaughter over the Mediterranean proved the P-38's tactical dominance, its most famous and strategically significant moment occurred thousands of miles away in the Pacific, in a mission that relied entirely on the aircraft's unprecedented range and precision. In April 1943, American codebreakers intercepted a top-secret Japanese signal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind the Pearl Harbor attack, was planning an inspection tour of the Solomon Islands. The window for an interception was terrifyingly small. A matter of minutes over the island of Bougainville, hundreds of miles from the nearest Allied base at Guadalcanal. No other Allied fighter could make the round trip. The mission was assigned to the 339th Fighter Squadron, flying P-38GS. On the morning of April 18th, 18 P-38s took off, flying just 30 feet above the waves to avoid Japanese radar. They flew a circuitous 400-mile route in total radio silence, navigating by dead reckoning alone. The timing had to be perfect. As they arrived at the intercept point, two Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers appeared, escorted by 6 A-6M0s. The P-38 split into two groups, a cover flight to climb and hold off the Zeros, and a killer flight to drive straight for the bombers. The engagement was a masterclass in the P-38's two-directions philosophy. While the cover flight engaged the Japanese escorts from above, Lieutenant Rex Barber and Captain Thomas Lanphier dived on the bombers from the flank. The Zeros, despite their legendary maneuverability, were caught out of position by the Lightning's high-speed approach. Barber's concentrated nose-gun fire tore into the engine of Yamamoto's bomber, sending it spiraling into the jungle. The second bomber was chased out to sea and destroyed. In a single, surgical strike, the P-38 had decapitated the Japanese Naval Command. This mission, known as Operation Vengeance, sent shockwaves through the Axis powers. It proved that the P-38 was not just a dogfighter. It was a strategic weapon capable of reaching out across hundreds of miles of empty ocean to strike with total surprise. Back in Europe, the news of the P-38's success fueled the growing dread among Luftwaffe pilots. They realized the fork-tailed devil was no longer just a nuisance over the Mediterranean. It was a hunter that could appear anywhere, at any time, coming from angles they could neither predict nor defend against. The era of the P-38 as the premier long-range predator of the skies had been solidified. The fallout from the P-38's dominance in 1943 was felt immediately within the high command of the Luftwaffe. General Adolf Galland, the inspector of fighters, began receiving frantic reports from the front lines regarding the psychological strain placed on German pilots. It wasn't just the losses, it was the realization that their standard defensive maneuvers were failing. In a Messerschmitt or a Focke-Wulf, the standard response to an attack was to break into a sharp, high G-turn. However, against a P-38 pincer, a pilot breaking left to avoid one attacker frequently found himself flying directly into the crosshairs of a second Lightning closing from the opposite vector. Statistically, the impact was staggering. In the Mediterranean theater alone, the P-38 was credited with destroying more than 2,500 Axis aircraft. In the Pacific, the numbers were even more lopsided. The two highest-scoring American aces of the entire war, Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire, earned all of their victories, 40 and 38 respectively, while flying the P-38. The aircraft's ability to survive heavy damage also meant that veteran American pilots were returning to base in planes that should have been unflyable. A P-38 could lose an entire engine to 20 mm cannon fire and still limp back across the English Channel or the Pacific Islands, preserving the precious human capital of experienced pilots that the Luftwaffe was rapidly losing. By early 1944, the German Air Ministry was forced to shift its entire defensive strategy. They began to pull elite units from the Eastern Front to bolster the defense of the Reich. But even then, they struggled to find an answer to the Lightning's range. The P-38 was the first Allied fighter to appear over Berlin, a feat that shattered the promise made by Hermann Göring that no enemy wings would ever darken the skies above the capital. The psychological fork-tailed devil had become a strategic reality. The German heartland was now within reach of a fighter that could not be easily outclimbed or outrun. As 1944 progressed, the role of the P-38 Lightning began to shift, yet its impact on the war effort only deepened. With the arrival of the P-51 Mustang, the Lightning was gradually relieved of its primary long-range escort duties in the European theater. However, rather than fading into the background, the P-38 evolved into a specialized multi-role platform that the Luftwaffe found equally terrifying. Its stable flight characteristics and massive lifting capacity made it the ideal pathfinder aircraft. Equipped with a transparent bombardier nose or specialized radar, P-38s led formations of heavy bombers through thick clouds to strike targets with precision that was previously impossible. The aircraft also became the premier photo reconnaissance tool of the Allied forces. Flying the F-5 variant, a P-38 stripped of its guns and filled with cameras, pilots flew solo missions at extreme altitudes. They were the silent eyes that mapped the Atlantic Wall before D-Day and tracked the movement of German panzer divisions. Because the P-38 was so fast, the Luftwaffe's radar-guided interceptors often couldn't scramble in time to catch them. This constant surveillance deprived the German command of the element of surprise, as every movement they made was captured by a fork-tailed devil circling 6 miles above. Furthermore, the technological lessons learned from the P-38's two directions, pincer tactics, were codified into official use-off doctrine. The realization that concentrated nose-mounted fire was superior to wing-mounted fire influenced the design of the next generation of combat aircraft. By the time the war entered its final months, the P-38 had paved the way for the jet age. It had proven that the complexity of twin-engine operation was worth the price for the advantage of redundant power and devastating concentrated fire. The Luftwaffe pilots who survived their encounters with the Lightning often spoke of it with a mix of resentment and professional respect. It was a machine that had changed the geometry of their sky, turning a horizontal battlefield into a three-dimensional trap. The legacy of the P-38 Lightning is etched into the history of warfare not merely as a collection of impressive specifications, but as a paradigm shift in the psychology of aerial combat. Before the fork-tailed devil appeared, the sky was a place of individual gallantry, a series of one-on-one duels where the more agile plane usually emerged the victor. The P-38, with its twin engines and its synchronized pincer maneuvers, ended that era. It introduced a cold, geometric lethality to the clouds, proving that technology and coordinated tactics could overwhelm even the most seasoned individual pilot. Kelly Johnson's radical gamble in 1937 created more than just a fast interceptor. It created a bridge to the future. The P-38 was the ultimate expression of the piston engine era's potential, pushing the limits of speed, altitude, and range until the sound barrier itself began to protest against its wings. It was a machine of contradictions, a heavy, complex beast that required the touch of surgeon to master, yet a rugged survivor that could bring a pilot home on a single engine through a hailstorm of flak. Today, the P-38 stands as a monument to a moment in time when American ingenuity met a global crisis with a design that looked like nothing else in the world. For the German pilots who faced it, the sight of those twin booms meant that the rules of engagement had changed forever. They weren't just fighting a pilot. They were fighting a system, a multi-directional, high-altitude predator that had turned the very sun against them. As we look back on the fork-tailed devil, we see the blueprint for modern air superiority, a fusion of range, concentrated power, and the terrifying efficiency of a trap from which there was no escape.